We are back again with On the Moneyline, a podcast by MMAPlay365. I'm your host Newsome, and we're here again at Fight Island on Yas Island in Abu Dhabi. Last weekend saw some great fights and two very solid performances from UFC champions Israel Adesanya and Jan Blachowicz. This card, I have to admit, is much weaker from a name perspective, but it's usually these events that turn out to be the super fun ones. But just before we get into the breakdowns, a quick reminder that the Golden Gamble Challenge is still running over at MMAPlay365, and it will continue to do so throughout this UFC Fight Island marathon. And if you missed the details last week, we have cut our annual subscription price in half for you, 50% off, so it's now just $150 instead of the usual $300. However, it gets better. If the official bets, so the bets that I personally play and track third party at betmma.tips, do not profit after the 5 UFC Fight Island events combined, then anybody who has purchased the annual subscription during this run at Fight Island will get 100% of their money back, and we'll keep your subscription active for the remainder of that 12 months too. Either we profit on the official bets or you get that annual subscription for free. And when you really think about it, if we do profit on those official bets, you'll have likely made that $150 back anyway. The results from last weekend mean that we are plus 1.5 units after event number 1, with 4 events in the challenge remaining. Get on board by going to MMAPlay365.com and adding that annual subscription to your basket. And let's break down some fights in the main event of the night. In the women's bantamweight division, we've got Holm versus Irene Aldana. Holm is currently the minus 120 favourite. The comeback on Aldana at plus 100 as the underdog. In regards to where the value is on this betting line, the lines are really close, and I think it's one of those fights where if you've got a really good read on either side, then either side's playable for sure. As for where the line moves, it has been fluctuating quite a little bit over the last few days. We've seen Holm as a minus 125 favourite, which she still is in some books. We've seen Aldana as a plus 105 underdog, and we've also seen this fight as a pick'em. So with that current trend, I think it does continue. I think we'll see fluctuation, and I don't think the lines will be too far off where they're at right about now come Saturday night. And as for how this fight plays out, it's really interesting because Holm is 38 now. She's getting up in age a little bit, and I think her performances are really starting to reflect that lately too. She's not fighting badly, but again, it's like I talk about some of the heavyweights, like Junior Dos Santos is the best example. I think Holm is just changing a game, just evolving, so she can have that longevity in her career. So she's a striker, a boxer, kickboxer, good hands, good kicks. She's always been a counter fighter. She's always been sharp, but lately she is looking towards the grind and to the wrestling. And we really saw that in the Raquel Pennington fight. That fight hardly took place on the feet at all, and I think a lot of people expected that to be a striking battle, but it wasn't. It consisted of Holm finding her timing, finding a range on the feet, and then closing that distance quickly, pushing Raquel Pennington back to the fence, holding her there, and landing short shots safely, enough for the referee not to split them up, and ultimately she took a very, shall we say, dull decision. That's not the Holm that we've been used to seeing over the years. The Amanda Nunes loss, that was a little different just because Amanda Nunes is a completely different animal. The Megan Anderson fight, again, we thought that might be a striker versus striker fight, but she went in there, she took Megan Anderson down, and again, she grinded a decision out through wrestling and grappling. Again, not the Holm we're used to seeing, so I'm just wondering how competitive Holm can be on the feet now, whether she knows that or not, or whether it's just being a tactical game plan against these two women in Anderson and Raquel Pennington that's ultimately got her the win. I'm not too sure. I do feel, though, against Aldana is predominantly a boxer. She mixes in kicks a little bit as well, but Aldana is a fighter with tons of movement, tons of volume. She'll throw even if she's going to miss the shot, miss the strike, she'll still throw it. She'll still put the feints out. She'll still push forward and just look to land at every opportunity. And I think over 5 rounds, if Aldana doesn't slow, I think she's going to be a real problem for Holm. But it all comes back to what Holm's going to do inside the cage. If Holm does stay and strike with Aldana, sure, she'll land some counter strikes, but even so, you look at the striking accuracy against the striking defense of Holm, and it's a negative combined number. And then when you're adding the movement in this fight, in and out of range, lateral movement, I think Aldana is going to cause problems for Holm on the feet. So if this fight stays standing over 5 rounds, I do favour Irene Aldana to win the fight. But if Holm has got this same game plan as she had against Raquel Pennington, where she'll just close the distance, push Aldana back to the cage, grind her out, maybe try and shoot a couple of takedowns. Aldana's got decent takedown defense, but Holm proved in that Pennington fight she doesn't need the takedowns to win the fight in that way. I think Holm is really, really solid and strong in those clinch positions. So if that's the game plan again here to push Aldana back, I think in the early stages of the fight she'll have difficulty because that's when Aldana's movement is definitely at its best. But the longer this fight goes on, with it being 5 rounds, I do think Holm could have some success there, should she not tire herself. But that's the thing. If Holm is implementing that type of game plan, I do think at some point she'll start slowing down herself as well. The strength might not be as prominent as what it was earlier in the fight. And again, I just feel that comes back to Aldana in regards to, will Aldana be able to get away from those clinched positions if Holm starts tiring late in the fight? And ultimately here, over 5 rounds, I'm just not convinced Holm can do that for 5 rounds. She might be able to do it for 3 rounds, and in that case, she might win the fight. But over 5 rounds, I think the movement's going to be a bit of a problem for her. Aldana isn't static, feet planted like Raquel Pennington. She will be dancing around the cage, as I've already mentioned, sliding in and out of range, using lateral movement and landing volume. And ultimately, I think that's what it comes down to. I think it's going to be volume versus control time. I think the volume is going to play a bigger factor than control time. I think Aldana's going to land more on Holm, and I think the longer this fight goes on, if Holm keeps going back to those clinch positions, I think Aldana will start to be able to find an exit quicker than the previous time. I think if that happens, it'll start to be a bad look in the judges' eyes that Holm is trying to get the clinch positions and just stall the fight. And if I am right in that scenario, I think the judges will then start to look at, okay, well, who's been landing more shots, who's been the more active fighter, and I just see that being Aldana over 5 rounds, should it go to the scorecards, of course. So for that reason, I'm picking Irene Aldana to win this fight. And in the next fight, in the co-main event, we've got Yorgan De Castro versus Carlos Felipe. De Castro's currently the -255 favourite. The comeback on Felipe at +215 as the underdog. As for where the value is in this fight, I don't think there's a ton of value, if I'm being honest, but I do think that there is slight value still on the line of Yorgan De Castro. I did expect De Castro to be a -275 favourite, roughly around that sort of line, so being -255, I do see a little bit of value there. As for where this betting line moves towards fight night, again, I'm not too sure we see it move too far from where we're at right about now with it. I think there will be a little bit of money coming back in on De Castro, and if that happens, I think people will start taking a dog shot on Carlos Felipe. And again, I think it'll balance itself out. As for how this fight plays out, though, this is going to be a good fight for both guys, specifically Carlos Felipe. He is predominantly a striker. If he can get on top of his opponent, he is very heavy on top, and he will lay there, and he will grind that position out. He'll land shots, enough shots for a referee not to stand him up. But ultimately, he does like to stay on the feet. He does like to stand and bang. And against Sergey Spivak on his UFC debut, he didn't get that fight. Spivak wanted the fight on the mat at all times. He did score 3 takedowns against Carlos Felipe, and he did grind that decision out. Like I've just said, it's just not the fight that Felipe wanted and not the type of fight that he thrives in. However, as the old saying goes, be careful what you wish for, because even though he's going to get this fight against Yorgan De Castro, the fight that he wants, a striking battle, Yorgan De Castro, I'll be shocked if he goes for takedowns. So Felipe's going to get what he wants here. However, I just don't think it's going to play out how he wants. Yorgan De Castro is a very good striker. He's got unbelievable power in the low kicks, probably his biggest weapon. And when those kicks land, they are devastating. He's finished fighters before with the low kicks, so that's definitely something that Carlos Felipe has got to look out for. But Yorgan De Castro's also got quick hands as well. He throws with power. He's got good timing. We saw that in the Justin Tafa fight on his UFC debut. Timed that punch beautifully and got that walk-off knockout against Tafa. I think Carlos Felipe has got to really try and put Yorgan De Castro on the back foot, because if he waits around a little too much here, I think De Castro's going to get off on those low kicks. And I think if he doesn't finish him with the low kicks, he'll finish him by making him static, making him inactive, and then finishing him with the hands. So for me, Carlos Felipe's got to rush forward. He's got to be careful whilst doing so as well. He can't do it recklessly, otherwise he'll end up knocked out himself. Again, just like Justin Taffer. But he's got to put pressure on De Castro, not give him time to really start calculating his shots and getting his timing and his reads down. And actually, Felipe does that really well. And he's got good cardio when doing that, which is something I was surprised about when I watched tape on him for his UFC debut. And obviously again here. Ultimately, though, I don't think it's going to be enough. I think if Felipe does come forward, he might be a little bit reckless and he might get hit with that counter shot. And if he doesn't, like I say, I think his legs are going to get tore up a little bit. And I think he'll either come unstuck with those low kicks, or, as I've already mentioned, those low kicks will really stifle the movement and stifle the attack, allowing Yorgan De Castro to start landing punches and put him out that way. So for those reasons, I am picking Yorgan De Castro to win this fight. And in the next fight, this is probably the most interesting fight from a stylistic perspective on the entire card. We've got Germaine de Randamie versus Juliana Pena. De Randamie is currently the -130 favourite. The comeback on Pena at +110 as the underdog. As for where the value is in this fight, I do still think that there's value in de Randamie's line. The betting line has moved quite a lot. It's fluctuated a lot over the last 24 to 48 hours. We've seen de Randamie at plus money. Now we're seeing Pena at plus money. Again, like I said with the main event, we've seen the fight as a pick'em as well. But even still at -130, I did expect de Randamie to be a slightly bigger favourite. But I don't think that she should have been a much bigger favourite from where she is right about now. So that's why I think there's minimal value. As for where the line moves, I think again it's going to fluctuate a little bit. And I know this seems to be the theme of this podcast in regards to the betting line movement. But I do think that more money will come in on de Randamie. I think we will see her at -140, maybe even -150, but at that point the value will completely switch over to Juliana Pena. I think people will recognise that, and I think we'll see money coming back in on Pena. Ultimately, I think we might see de Randamie close -125, Pena +100 maybe. And as for how this fight plays out, as I've already mentioned, stylistically, it's a really, really interesting fight because it is a striker versus grappler fight. Both women are relatively well-rounded, but like I say, you've got de Randamie, who is predominantly the striker, and then you've got Pena, who's predominantly the grappler. And actually, both fighters' weaknesses are both their opponent's strengths. That's what makes this fight really interesting. Germaine de Randamie, the one thing that you do have to be concerned about here with de Randamie is, in that fight against Amanda Nunes, she was taken down 8 times. Those takedowns started to get easier and easier for Nunes. Now, you can make the argument that Nunes is just an absolute beast, which she is. She's the best women's fighter that we've ever seen in mixed martial arts, period. But the fact is, de Randamie still got taken down 8 times. The bigger problem for me in that fight and in those scenarios is that there was a lot of period of time where de Randamie wasn't trying to get back up to her feet. She was sort of accepting position a little bit. She was out of position a lot of the time as well. Rather than just recovering guard, she was pulling her legs out at different angles, and it was allowing Amanda Nunes to have a lot of success. However, to counter that, there was also some good moments as well. We saw de Randamie throw up her legs for submissions. We saw her trying to get Nunes in an armbar. We saw in moments that de Randamie was trying to grab a single leg to re-wrestle or to help herself get back up to the feet. So for the bad moments that de Randamie had on the mat on her back, she also showed glimpses of good moments too, which does ultimately make me believe that we could potentially give de Randamie a pass for the fact that she was fighting Amanda Nunes. However, that pass doesn't mean it can't happen in this fight, and it's something that de Randamie has got to be very, very cautious of, because you have got Juliana Pena, who will look to get fights to the mat. She doesn't have the traditional wrestling takedowns, which again could help de Randamie in this fight, because a lot of those takedowns that Amanda Nunes was scoring were from double legs, getting her down to the mat that way, whereas Pena looks to get body locks and looks to trip or drag her opponents down. And with de Randamie, I do think that that might be helpful for her in this fight, because she's very strong in the clinch. She frames off really well defensively and offensively as well in the clinch, and she is strong. She's got a wide base, so I don't think she's going to be easily taken down with those style of takedowns that Pena likes to come in the cage with. However, with that said, if Pena's relentless, I do think that she'll get her down a couple of times. And when she's on the mat, when she's on top, I think that she will be as dominant as what Amanda Nunes was. And I think she might even look for submission attempts as well, which again is a weakness of Randamie. That's why this fight is such a good fight from a stylistic perspective. Ultimately, though, I do think that this fight will be won and lost on the feet. And when you talk about the gap in skill in this fight, sure, Pena's got advantages over Randamie on the mat, but on the feet, Randamie is just a completely different beast. This is a fighter that was hitting Amanda Nunes with some clean, hard shots, forcing Amanda Nunes to wrestle. Amanda Nunes wanted nothing to do with that stand-up, and this is something we don't talk about with Amanda Nunes because she's normally the aggressive fighter. She's normally the fighter that's hurting her opponent, that's dropping her opponent or knocking her opponent out. But against Randamie, it was a completely different story, and I think that speaks volumes to where Randamie is at in regards to the quality of her striking. And ultimately, I think that's going to be the difference in this fight. I do think that there might be some takedowns for Juliana Pena, but I think the volume's going to be there for Randamie. I think the moments, the big action moments are going to be there for Randamie. And the bottom line for me is, for Pena to be successful in this fight, she's got to get into the wheelhouse of Randamie. And that's a problem because she's got to fight that fire with fire. And I think Randamie is going to come out on top. So for those reasons, I'm picking Germaine Randamie to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Dequan Townsend versus Dusko Todorovic, who's finally making his UFC debut. Todorovic is currently the -330 favourite. The comeback on Townsend at +270 as the underdog. As for where the value is in this fight, I don't think there's a great deal on the money line of either fighter, if I'm being honest. I think the line is a little wide, but I get it at the same time, and that's why I don't think there's much value. And as for where the line moves, I do think we are going to see a little bit more money coming in on Todorovic as well. So I think the line's wide where it is now, but I do think that it could get wider. I think Townsend at this point, he's 0-3 in the UFC. He has had 3 hard fights against good opponents, but it does beg the question if he is UFC caliber. And I always say that I hate to talk about fighters in that respect, and it's true, I don't like to say it, but ultimately the UFC, you do have to be a certain level, and I'm just not convinced yet he is at that certain level. And it's not a coincidence he's closed at +240, +295, +280, now he's +270. So yeah, it wouldn't shock me to see this betting line get a little bit wider come fight night on Saturday night. As for how this fight plays out, though, I actually think that Townsend is getting a stylistic fight that is much more favourable to him, and he should enjoy this fight much more than he did in his last 3 fights. And what I mean by that is, when you look at his 3 opponents in the UFC, you've got Devin Clark, wrestler, grinder. You've got Bevon Lewis, who is good in the clinch, again a grinder. And then you've got Dalcha Lungiambula, again a fighter that does like to wrestle and uses physique and his strength to really impose his will. Those types of fighters really cause Townsend problems, to the point where Townsend couldn't really get his game going. He was just getting grinded out, or he was getting taken down. Whereas Todorovic is a bit of a different fighter. He is an aggressive fighter, a fighter that will come forward, look to land bombs, but he's not a fighter that will overly tie up with his opponent. When the fights do hit close to the cage, Todorovic will tie up, just like most fighters will. But unless Todorovic has seen something in the weaknesses of Townsend to make him come in with that game plan, I don't think that we're going to see a similar fight to what we saw against Devin Clark or Bevon Lewis, if I'm being honest. However, I don't think that that's still going to be enough for Townsend to get the win here. I do think Todorovic is very aggressive. He can take a shot. He'll come forward. I think he'll push Townsend backwards, and that's where Townsend has real problems, when he's pushed backwards. When he can come forwards, he's actually not the worst fighter. You know, he will strike, he can land punches, he can mix in wrestling, and he can actually have some decent performances. But that's if he's the one going forwards. I think Todorovic is too much of an aggressor here in this fight. I think he's going to be landing a barrage of strikes. The thing is, for Townsend, if he doesn't get finished early in this fight, then he might have a chance later in the fight. And the reason I say this is because I don't think Todorovic's cardio for how he fights, being very aggressive and very fast and throwing a ton of volume early in the fight, I don't think that kind of cardio is going to travel with him for 3 rounds. So if Townsend can weather a 5-10 minute storm in this fight, then he might have moments later in the round. But again, I just don't think it's going to be enough on the night. I think Todorovic is going to land some hard shots. I think he's going to be the one looking better in the judges' eyes. I think even if he wins the first 2 rounds and gasses in the third, I'm not sure Townsend will be able to finish him in the third to take that victory. So for me, I think Todorovic has got multiple paths to victory in this fight. I think he could potentially hurt Townsend early on. And if he doesn't, and it does go to the scorecards, I do think that Todorovic will be winning 2 out of those 3 rounds at least. So for those reasons, I'm picking Dusko Todorovic to win this fight. And in the next fight, I think this is going to be a wild one. We've got Phillips versus Cameron Else making his UFC debut. Phillips currently the minus 420 favourite. The comeback on Else at plus 335 as the underdog. Now, as for where the value is in the betting line, again, I don't think there's a ton of value. I think the line is relatively fair and relatively justified, although I do think it could be a little bit shorter. But ultimately, like I say, I think this is going to be a bit of a wild fight. Wild fights, crazy things can happen. And for me, that's why I don't think there's value in the money line at all right here. With that being said, though, again, I don't think a lot of people are going to be rushing to the betting window to lay that plus 335 either. As for where the line moves, it wouldn't shock me to see Phillips drop below that minus 400 line, and it wouldn't shock me to see Cameron Else drop below the plus 300 line either. But ultimately, we are going to see Phillips go into the cage on Saturday night quite a heavy favourite. As for how this fight plays out, though, as I'm now about to mention for the 3rd time breaking this fight down, I think it's going to be a wild fight. Cameron Else isn't a fighter that likes to sit back. He's not a fighter that likes to counter. He's definitely a fighter that likes being on the front foot, likes getting in the face of his opponent. He's aggressive. He comes forward hard. The thing is, I think Phillips is going to be able to handle that aggression and handle that pressure. And even though Else has got more experience, more fights on his record, I think Phillips has been in there with the better guys, and you just got to look back at his last fight as an example of that. Gabriel Silva is a very good fighter and a very well-rounded fighter too. Really good striking, legit black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and their fight was very fast-paced and it was very dangerous for Phillips, and yet he dealt with it really well. He scored takedowns, he landed a ton of volume on the feet, and I don't want to take anything away from Cameron Else, but he's on a 6-fight win streak, and you look at those records of his opponents during that win streak. We've got 3-14, 0-1, 4-0, 0-0, 1-1, 0-0. So although he is on good form right now, he's only beaten one guy in that run of form that's got a positive record. But for one of the opponents to be 3-14 and then 2 opponents making their MMA debuts, I don't think that it's a very good look in this fight. It doesn't mean he can't win, but it just means that when you're looking at experience in regards to the level of opponent, then Phillips, for me, you've got to have more trust in him than you have with Cameron Else. I think Phillips will mix in takedowns in this fight. He's got to be careful because Else has got a good guillotine. He's got good chokes. He has choked a few people out. So Phillips can't be lazy with those entries. But I do think that if he can stay out of trouble against someone like Gabriel Silva, who is a very high-level black belt, then I don't think that, or he shouldn't have too much issue with Cameron Else on the mat, put it that way. I think Phillips is going to be able to land volume, maybe not in the early stages of the fight. I honestly do believe he's going to have a storm to weather here, but he could weather that storm with those early takedowns, really slow the fight down, really take the wind out of Cameron Else, and then when the fight progresses, goes later into the rounds, the fight starts to play out more on the feet than it did in the early stages. I think that's when the volume could come. So for me, ultimately, I think that Phillips has got the tools to really slow the fight down when things might be getting a little bit too much for him coming back from Cameron Else. And then he's also got the tools to see that fight out and ultimately control the latter stages of the fight. So for those reasons, I'm picking Phillips to win this fight. And in the next fight, I think this is such good matchmaking. We've got 2 veterans here. We've got Condit versus McGee. McGee currently the minus 135 favourite. The comeback on Condit at plus 115 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think it sits with Condit right now. I think the line should be a pick'em, I'll be honest. But at plus 115, that plus money on Condit, I'd be saying the same thing if it was the other side on McGee, if McGee was plus money as well. If there's plus money in this fight, I think that's where the value is. As for where the line moves, I don't think it's going to get too much further from where we're at right about now. And the reason I say that, after saying that I think the line is a little bit too wide, is because McGee opened at plus money. All the money's come back in on him, and now he's the favourite. So I think the public have really spoken here. I do think if the line gets slightly worse, we see Court McGee at -140, -145. I think that'll be disrespectful at that point, and I do anticipate money coming back in on Condit in that scenario. But come fight night on Saturday night, I don't think the betting lines are going to be too far off where they're at right about now. And as for how this fight plays out, as I've already mentioned, I think the matchmaking's perfect here. We see time and time again these older veterans that might not be able to compete at the level they used to be competing at, coming into fights against dangerous guys that are likely going to really beat them up badly or knock them out, and it's just really sad to see. But here, the UFC have put two of these guys together. I don't think there's going to be too much chaos inside the cage. I don't think either fighter is going to take a lot of damage, but they both get to be inside the octagon again. They both get to compete, and they both get to earn a paycheck. I think it's great to see, and I think the UFC should match more fights like this. Now, as for both guys, you've got Carlos Condit, who's on a 5-fight losing streak. He hasn't won a fight in over 5 years. Again, it's really sad to even say those words, but that's the reality of what we're dealing with. And on the other side, with Court McGee, in his last 5 fights, he's only 1-4 himself, so he's not doing too much better either. But for me, with these records and this recent run of form, I do think Carlos Condit is a little better, even though he's not won in 5 years. The reason I say that, you look at the guys he's lost against: Robbie Lawler, Damian Maia, Neil Magny, Cowboy Oliveira, and Michael Chiesa. And there really is no shame in losing to any of those fighters. They're all really top fighters. And although Court McGee has lost against some good fighters, I just don't think they're at the caliber of what Condit's been facing. So Court McGee's lost against Sean Brady, who I think is a phenomenal fighter, by the way. For me, Sean Brady is a fighter that I think a lot of fighters will lose against in this division. Diego Lima, though, Sean Strickland, Ben Saunders, again, decent fighters, but just not the level of Condit. As for style versus style here, though, I think it all depends on Court McGee. If Court McGee comes out and wrestles, he's got a strong wrestling background. He's a good wrestler inside the cage, but he doesn't always use it. However, if he does come into this fight and does use his wrestling, I think that is a perfect path to victory for McGee for sure. Because as good as Condit has been throughout the entirety of his career, the one weakness he's always had is his takedown defense. The takedown defense is really not that good at this level in the UFC, and I don't think it ever has been. He's always been a dangerous striker, a phenomenal striker, but that takedown defense is really poor. And if Court McGee wants to come here and relentlessly wrestle, I think that's quite a simple path to victory for him. But that's under the assumption that Court McGee wrestles. For me, there's just no guarantees that he's actually going to come out and do that. If he doesn't, this fight's going to be razor close because, again, McGee hasn't got bad striking, but I still think Carlos Condit has got qualities in striking, especially at distance, especially if he can keep McGee away from him. I think if that happens, if that scenario happens, I think Condit wins this fight relatively easily as well. But again, it's all up to McGee, because even if McGee's not shooting takedowns, does he close the distance? Does he get a hold of Condit? Does he push Condit against the cage? If he does, and he's in those dominant positions, then yeah, he might be able to run that clock down, grind Condit out, but Condit's quite dangerous in the clinch with elbows and knees. I think it's going to be a really interesting fight. If Condit can keep the fight vertical, I think he's got a phenomenal chance of winning. And I think if McGee goes for the wrestling, then I think McGee is going to have a great chance of winning. I'm going to side with Carlos Condit in this fight. I just simply don't trust McGee to come out here and put on a wrestling clinic. There's been a number of his previous fights where you think a wrestling game plan would have seriously improved the performance of the fight, and he's just not gone out there and done it. So for those reasons, I do think the fight plays out a lot on the feet. I do think it's won and lost on the feet, and I'm picking Carlos Condit to win this fight. And in the next fight, going back to the matchmaking, I think this is a pretty bad matchup. We've got Joshua Culibao versus Charles Jourdain. Charles Jourdain currently the -450 favourite. The comeback on Culibao at +360 as the underdog. As for where the value is in this fight, it is getting close to the type of line where it's hard to justify, but at -450, I do think that there is some slight value in Charles Jourdain in this fight. As I mentioned, I just think it's a terrible stylistic matchup, a terrible matchup from skill set versus skill set, and for Charles Jourdain to come from Andre Fili to Joshua Culibao. I don't mean any disrespect to Culibao, but there is levels in this game, and I just don't think he's anywhere close to the level of Jourdain. As for where the line moves, I do think that we see Charles Jourdain into -500, -550. It might even get to -600 come fight night. That wouldn't shock me either. As for how this fight plays out, I think Jourdain has got Culibao's number no matter where this fight goes. On the feet, I think Jourdain is a much better striker. He's got more power, he's more technical, he's got better movement, he's got more volume, he's more dynamic. And then even in the wrestling and on the ground, I think with Culibao being predominantly a striker, when he's on his back, we saw against Jalen Turner, he didn't really have an answer for it. So even though Charles Jourdain prefers striking and being exciting and throwing those flashy strikes, he's got a very easy path to victory if he decides to take Culibao down. And on the mat, he would have three options as well. He's got the option to transition to a better position, to land ground and pound and finish Culibao via strikes. He's also the better grappler, so he's got the option to submit Culibao down on the mat, or he could just lay on the mat, grind Culibao down, waste time on the clock, beat him up a little bit and take a decision. So for me, that groundwork is a very easy path to victory. But if this stays on the feet, I just think Charles Jourdain is going to be too much for Culibao on the feet as well. I just don't see a legit path to victory for Culibao apart from a puncher's chance, which 4-ounce gloves every fighter's got. I just don't see it happening though. I think Jourdain will win this fight no matter where it goes. I think he should be making this relatively comfortable as well. I'm picking Charles Jourdain to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got two fighters making the UFC debut. We've got Jordan Williams versus Nassourdine Imavov. Jordan Williams is currently the -145 favourite. The comeback on Imavov at +125 as the underdog. As for where the value is at in this fight, I actually think the value sits with Imavov as the underdog. After tape, I do think the betting line should be a little bit closer, and it really wouldn't have shocked me if Imavov was the favourite, the slight favourite in this fight either. As for where the line moves, I do think we're going to see some money coming in on Imavov the closer we get to fight night. I don't think it'll be enough to completely flip the betting line, but it wouldn't surprise me if come fight night on Saturday night, this fight entered as a pick'em. And as for how this fight plays out, I feel that Jordan Williams is a little bit erratic inside the cage. I think he comes forward a little bit recklessly. I don't think he has a lot of concern for his defensive striking. I think he gets hit quite a lot. He doesn't really move his head too much either. As long as he's aggressing, he's pushing forward, he's landing shots on his opponent, I don't think he really cares too much about what's coming back at him. But at this level in the UFC, when you get under these bright lights at the top of the sport, that sort of thing really does matter. And Imavov, although he's got that "ov" at the end of his name, he doesn't look to be an aggressive wrestler, a relentless wrestler. He does look to be quite a calculated striker, and that's where I think he's got a good stylistic matchup here, because he's going to have somebody in front of him that's coming forward hard, that's winging shots at him, that probably isn't moving the head off the centre line too much and probably is going to be a little bit hittable. And for Imavov, there might be a weather to storm. He might have to stay calm for a couple of minutes, feel his way into the fight. But in Imavov's previous fights, you can really see that he's a patient fighter, a fighter that is calculated, a fighter with good IQ, that takes his time and feels his way into the fight once he's made his reads. And those traits are really going to help him in this fight. He's just got to stay safe for the first few minutes, maybe the first round, while Williams is being overly aggressive. But eventually, I think Imavov is going to get his timing down. I think he's going to start landing on Williams. I think he's going to be able to move in and out of range really well. I think he's going to exit out of bad spots the longer the fight goes on. And I think he's going to be able to either hurt Williams and put him out, or I think if it goes to the scorecards, I think we'll see a scenario where Imavov has won at least 2 of the 3 rounds. Probably 2 if he's took a step back in round 1. But either way, I think Imavov has got the more paths to victory in this fight. I'm picking Nassourdine Imavov to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Loma Lookboonmee versus Jinh Frey. Loma Lookboonmee currently the -135 favourite. The comeback on Frey at +115 as the underdog. As for where the value is in this betting line, I do think there's minimal value on Lookboonmee. I do think the line's fair at the same time though as well. There has been money coming in on Lookboonmee over the last 24 to 48 hours. I do think more value was on a couple of days ago, but there's still some value right now. I don't think Lookboonmee should be -145, -150. So if it gets to that sort of line, I think the value will shift onto the underdog in Frey. And as for where the line moves, I do think money will come in on Frey right now, because I do believe that Lookboonmee is at that limit of being very close to losing any value on the money line. I think people might recognise that. Money might come back in on Frey. I think we'll see Lookboonmee close -125, -130 come fight night on Saturday night. As for how this fight plays out though, again, stylistically, it's a very interesting fight, because although both women are well-rounded, Lookboonmee is predominantly a striker, and although Frey is predominantly a striker as well, I do feel that she's got the wrestling in this fight to cause Lookboonmee problems. So if she's got that game plan, if she comes in looking to wrestle, looking to take Lookboonmee down, I think she'll be able to do it. Angela Hill, although she is at the top of the division, she was able to do that against Lookboonmee in spells, but she's predominantly a striker with a Muay Thai background. So I do think that it's a hole in Lookboonmee's game that she needs to patch up. But at the same time, I don't think that she's a fighter that you're just going to be able to take down at will. Every takedown you shoot, you're going to get her down. Then you're going to spend a couple of minutes control time on top. I don't think she's that sort of fighter. She is a fighter that does have skills and qualities on the mat. She's definitely not a fish out of water down there. And then when you look at the striking, this is where I think the fight's going to be won and lost, because although I do anticipate some takedowns coming in from Frey, I do think that Lookboonmee will be able to get back up to her feet before any significant damage is being done, before any points are being scored for too much control time. And that means that in that scenario, the fight should be won and lost on the feet. I think this is where Loma Lookboonmee shines. She's got that huge Muay Thai background. She's been fighting all her life. And I think although Frey's a decent striker, I think Lookboonmee is more technical and she's got more volume. I think she'll be able to push that volume and push that pace throughout the 3 rounds as well, should it go to the judges' scorecards. And I think the fight has actually got a high likelihood of hitting the judges' scorecards. And when we get there, I think the judges will have to look at some of the wrestling, some of the control time. But I think the volume, I think the pressure, and I think the accuracy of the strikes coming back from Loma Lookboonmee will just look better in the judges' eyes than maybe 20 to 30 seconds control on the mat. For those reasons, I'm picking Loma Lookboonmee to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Casey Kenney versus Heili Alateng. Casey Kenney currently the -300 favourite. The comeback on Alateng at +250 as the underdog. As for where the value is in this fight, even at -300, I still think there's value on Casey Kenney. I think that this is a really bad matchup for Alateng. They're both very similar fighters. I just believe Kenny's better everywhere. As for where the line moves, I think the line on Kenney is only going to get worse. I don't think it'll exceed -350. I would be surprised if it did. Alateng isn't that bad, but I do think up to -350, it's relatively fair. As for how this fight plays out, as I've just mentioned, I think they're both quite similar in regards to their styles. So they can both strike. They've both got accurate striking. They both throw in combinations. They'll mix hands with the kicks as well. I just think Casey Kenney's a better technical striker, a fighter that's going to land more volume across the 3 rounds or across each round until the fight ends. And staying on the striking just for a second, I would give the power edge to Alateng, but honestly, I don't think Casey Kenney's chinny. I don't think Alateng's going to land something on him that knocks him out, and if he hurts him, Kenny's got wrestling to fall back on. He's durable, he might recover, but that wrestling will certainly help in a bad spot. And leading on to that wrestling, Alateng likes takedowns as well. He likes to shoot in, get on top of his opponent, but the gap in skill in the wrestling is just astronomical here. Casey Kenney is a seriously good wrestler, good completion rate, good scrambles, good top control, good submissions, and I think that absolutely trumps everything that Alateng brings to the cage. And you can see in Alateng's fights, he really likes to add that wrestling to his game plan. It really helps his game and elevates it. But in this fight, when he realises that that wrestling is nullified and he's outgunned in the wrestling department and that he can only strike, I really think it's going to throw his game off. And then after he realises that he can only strike and that Casey Kenney is definitely a good striker too, again, I think there's going to be problems for Alateng because Kenney will have the wrestling. He will have that second path to victory. And for me, that's why this fight should be relatively comfortable for Casey Kenney. I'm picking Casey Kenney to win this fight. And in the final fight of this breakdown, we've got Yesin Ayari versus Luigi Vendramini. Ayari is currently the -115 favourite with the comeback on Vendramini, the slight -105. underdog. Now, as for where the value is on this betting line, this is actually a betting line that's flipped because Vendramini opened the -175 favourite. Ayari was +135. All that money came back in on Ayari. It put Vendramini at -125. It sat at -125 for a couple of days, and then this morning it's flipped. Ayari, the current slight favourite. And because of this line flip, I actually think the value is on the slight underdog in Vendramini in this fight. I really like his style. I think he's going to cause a lot of fighters problems in the division. And ultimately, I thought the betting line was much fairer at -125. But as for where this line moves, again, I can see fluctuation here because I think Vendramini is the slight underdog here. I think more money might come in on him now. It'll push it to a pick'em. It might push Vendramini to the slight favourite where Ayari is right now. And really, this could swing either way. But come fight night on Saturday night, I think it's going to be roughly around a pick'em. But as for how this fight plays out, I think it's going to be a really good fight. From a physical perspective, Yasin Ayari is a huge lightweight. He looked quite big at welterweight when he was fighting guys like Darren Till, but at lightweight, he is very big. And in his last fight against Stevie Ray, he showed that he can get down to that weight and still be relatively comfortable. He didn't show any signs of tiring, although the fight wasn't that fast of a pace. But he's a big lightweight. Whereas Vendramini, he's more of a little ball of energy. He's 5'8". He is going to be significantly smaller than Ayari. But like I say, he has that energy in him. He's got that aggression, that forward pressure. And I think that's what's going to make this fight so entertaining because Ayari, he's got technique in his strikes. He doesn't wing bombs. He doesn't come forward at 100 miles an hour. He likes to really take his time, feel his way into a fight, but landing hard shots at the same time. And he does have power in his hands. So does Vendramini, though. And when Vendramini gets inside of boxing range, he really lets his hands go, starts putting together solid combinations, and then he'll look to level change and take the fight down to the mat. And although he looks like that real aggressive, wild striker, he's actually predominantly a grappler. He's a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He's good on the mat. He's good transitioning. We saw him take the back of Zaleski dos Santos on his UFC debut, short notice, an upper weight class. Couldn't get the finish there though, not surprising, but he looked decent. Ayari's definitely got his work cut out for him in this fight. Ayari's got to make sure he's the one pushing Vendramini back, because if he's not, then he's probably going to lose this fight or get himself put into some really bad positions. For me, I think the fighter that is controlling the cage, I think the fighter that is pushing the action and forcing their opponent back is the fighter that's going to have more success. I know that's really easy to say, but some fighters are better fighting on the back foot, counter-striking. I don't think that's the case here. I think we've got a fight where both fighters thrive more going forward, far more than what they do moving backwards. I think because of that low centre of gravity, because of that wild aggression, that Vendramini is going to be that fighter pushing forward. I'm not sure how much success he actually has on the mat. I know he's a black belt, but Yasin Ayari has been with Dean Lister for many years. He was comfortable with Darren Till on top of him, throwing up triangles and arm bars. So how much success Vendramini has on top of Ayari should he take him down, I'm not too sure. But in regards to movement, pressure, aggression, sheer volume, and that takedown threat and the jiu-jitsu threat as well, I do think Vendramini will bring more to this fight than what Ayari would. It did seem that Yasin Ayari was looking to really improve. I thought he beat Stevie Ray in that fight. That was his first camp at American Top Team as well, ultimately his last fight. I did feel that Ayari was making really big strides with that move to American Top Team. He did look a lot better. He's still relatively young, so he's still going to be developing. But because of COVID-19, the coronavirus, he's not been able to get out at ATT just like a lot of the other European fighters. So how much that impacts his performance, I'm not too sure. But ultimately, I think it's going to be a really good fight. I think Ayari is going to pose problems for Vendramini as well. But ultimately, I think Vendramini edges the fight. I'm picking Luigi Vendramini to win this fight. And that's all for this episode of On the Moneyline. I hope you all enjoyed it, and once again guys, I'd appreciate all the likes to the video and subscriptions to the MMAPlay365 YouTube channel too. Remember, you can get all the betting advice you'll ever need over at MMAPlay365.com. We cater for long-term gamblers that like to build their own bets and strategies, gamblers that just want to follow exactly what I bet on, And we also cater for you fun gamblers that like the long shot fun parlays, or ACCAs as we call them in the UK. And we also support the DraftKings and FanDuel players with our daily fantasy sports content too, which comes with our very own private chat room on Discord, so you can chat to our expert throughout each fight week. We have plenty of different packages and subscription options for you guys to choose from. We've got a great offer with the Golden Gamble Challenge right now running too. Everything's at an affordable price. Just hop on to MMAPlay365.com and see what's best for you. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you at the next event.